I want to go back to that multi-supplier complexity that was highlighted as the number one challenge that people find in there. And the question is, how do you structure governance to particularly support collaboration and continual improvement? So not just your contractual meeting of requirements, but had to go the extra mile. How do you do that in a governance way?
I'll probably give you two of my top tips when you're looking at the complexity and the governance. What I won't do is go back and say keep it simple, because everybody knows that. But very often it's the governance element gets left until close to the end. And I think that's always a massive mistake. What decisions are you going to need to make? What outcomes are you trying to achieve? The governance should be one of the first things that you get in place and have an outline for, to help you to drive everything else. One of the tips would be to start looking at the governance first. The other thing I would do, I wouldn't just immediately think, the governance we've got now, we don't need it. SIAM, we're going to have a completely new set of governance. I would always try to reuse the governance models. If they're working well, try to reuse governance model. You might need to change one or two elements of it. For example, very often I'll go into an organization that have got a design authority, and design authority works well, and service management sometimes is even represented in service architecture as part of the design authority. Rather than ripping that out, maybe putting in there, just adding a SIAM flavor, get the SIAM salt shaker out there, and just make sure that SIAM is part of that. So wherever you can use existing governance to try and ease people into this new paradigm, then I would absolutely use that. So they're my top two tips. Make sure you do governance up front and reuse as much governance as you can that's already in there with a SIAM flavor. Don't rip it out just because of SIAM.
Okay. I'll take Barry's lead and see if I can get you top two tips as well from my perspective. So I just want to start with the question was governance for collaboration and continual improvement. And I think you're already behind the eight ball, because those elements, collaboration and continual improvement, are about quality and not quantity. So if you start looking at, we've got to put it in the contract, and I've seen contracts that talks about how many improvements you make in a month in there, and it just becomes a bit of a paper exercise, and this was an improvement and that was an improvement. So no, that's problem management. You found the root cause of something, or other arguments about it. And it doesn't matter how many improvements I make. I can make one improvement that is worth 10 times more than the other 10 improvements that I did in that week or that month as well. Looking at just the numbers and the contracts, which is also excluding internal staff as well, is not good. So my first top tip is make this an agenda item in your governance structures. So in your board meetings, make sure that collaboration and continual improvement is discussed, and make sure that people realize that collaboration and continual improvement are on the agenda of the board. They're under the attention of the board, back to accountability that we would talk about earlier, and it's important to do them. My second tip is the forums. I deliberately don't call them process forums, because I think that's too leading. We've got 34 practices in ITIL 4 and 27 processes in ITIL version 3. You don't need 27 of these forums, but create forums that are almost exclusively about bringing people together, to service providers particularly, maybe only your tier one, but bring people together without an agenda of we have to solve this major incident, we have to do this project or whatever, but to give them an opportunity to talk about, I like to improve this, we could improve this, we should do that better in there. And then, of course, you can formalize that, link your post-implementation reviews into it and your lessons learned, and build a continual improvement process around it. So you can do more and more with it. But starting with those structural elements, that's the top tip. The secondary tip to that, which is now my third tip, so I'm already going way past my number, is that if your forums don't work, stop them. Because I've seen people that basically go through the foundation body of knowledge and go, that's fantastic, we've got to have these forums. They set up these forums and people don't show up, or when people show up, it becomes finger pointing, or a lot of silence in there and then stop it. It is supposed to be a collaborative space, which again brings me back to OCM. So Helen, the question is, how do you structure governance to support collaboration and continual improvement? But from your particular expertise, the OCM angle, maybe.
So from an OCM angle, if you're introducing new providers in, I'd be really clear what their role is and how they fit in the bigger picture. And I would also say define the conditions for collaboration up front and communicate those across all providers through things like collaboration clauses. If you can't get clauses into contracts, think about collaboration letters covering roles, behaviours, tooling standards, and performance transparency.
Yeah, that's I have photos somewhere that I use in some of the training, which is a rather large global mining organization where some bigwigs of the organization and of their tier one providers are signing one of those novelty A-2 massive collaboration agreements, which is really a bunch of common sense things like we'll be courteous to each other and we'll be on time and stuff like that. But they're signing it and it's now hanging at the entrance of the IT part of the building in there. And it's just one of those little scene setters. This is what the big wigs expect from you because you work for their organization. And it almost gives you the opportunity that if Barry's not very nice to me, I can just point to that thing and go, hey, Barry, look at over there. Your executive director has signed that thing in there. Why aren't you doing that in there? And it probably wouldn't come to that, but it's such a nice, tangible way almost to get that OCM happening, set the directions clearly, set the definitions. If you can't get a clause in a contract, make an agreement or a statement, or even things like the code of conduct that people can look at and go, this is what is being expected.
I've just thought of one more thing that would be worth mentioning is one or two of the last assignments that I've been working on or started working on. The customer organisation that wants to invoke the SIAM model has given us a governance structure. But the one thing that they've done as the customer organisation, they've got most things. They've got routes for things that go wrong, a route for changes, fairly standard setup for governance. But the one thing they've forgotten is from the viewpoint of the service providers and from the viewpoint of the integrator, don't forget the meeting and don't forget the forum where they all get to talk about the customer without the customer there. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
I think
the
don't
secret
forget,
squirrel
because
stuff.
that's absolutely it, Simon. You know, that they need a chance to actually, none of us are going to say to the customer, actually, we think you suck in front of them, but to each other.
It's that
It's
thing.
maybe worth doing, isn't it?
You would have it as a consultant, and I assume you too, Helen, and I might come back to you again from that OCM angle in there. When you do a workshop and the customer says, do you want me there? And I always go, yeah, for the first 5 minutes, because I want you to introduce me. So I'm not a complete stranger that just walks from the pavement into this room in there. But then I want you to leave, because exactly that, people won't say the same things if the customer is in the room in there. So very good comment there. Helen, anything to add to that?
I also think it's good to do surveys as well. So get feedback from the providers on the integrator. Yeah, they could be anonymous or they can be actual, but also, yeah, it's a safe space to actually feedback on what they really think and what needs to be improved. So from an OCM angle, I'd recommend that as well, because not always it's evident in meetings what providers are really thinking or what's working, what's not.
Yeah, it's really
So
good. And because we're talking about qualitative aspects like collaboration and improvement, sentiment scores are really good. So a really simple question, how do you feel today about the integrator? And just a full smiley face down to frowny face or angry face in there and just click the button. You see them at some places where you just click buttons like how was the service? And it's just a number and trend story in there. And it's just great to do that the whole way around. Yeah, how do you feel about the integrator? How do you feel about the customer? How do you feel about provider X, about provider Y? But yeah, look at it throughout the whole SIAM environment. Barry,
Can I ask
your
a rhetorical question here almost, Simon, is around governance. I see more and more now organisations that start out where the service integrator is a hybrid. It's part customer, it's part provider, and it's usually part of one of the providers that would make it a lead provider model. So it's a kind of hybrid / lead provider type SIAM model. And that's where I think the governance and the role of the integrator becomes massively important, because there's a huge risk that people see the integrator as either a service provider or the customer or both, or they can't really decide, or a non-entity, it's a real issue, I think, where you get a hybrid
It,
lead
it
provider
absolutely
model.
is.
And I genuinely see that model as probably the most common in the UK now.
Yeah, well,
I do
find the
as well,
survey
Barry.
result. Thank you, Helen.
I was just agreeing with Barry that hybrid is the most common model that I've come across
And
as well,
it,
and it's a
it
challenge
makes
in terms of
sense
that.
because we find as an external service integrator that it is hard for customers to give work for us to do. They don't want to give it away, and that's fine. They can keep doing that in the hybrid model. But as I was saying, training, it is potentially the best of both worlds, internal versus external. But that means also it's potentially the worst of both worlds if you don't do that governance that Barry is pointing out. Don't make it clear who is doing what and how the two parties of the integrator, or three parties even, I've seen that as well, interact with each other.